Welcome everyone. Myself Dr. Praveen Kumar Pathak. I am working as an associate professor in the Department of Geography at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. And today I am assisted by Ms. Manisha Sharma on this lecture which is entitled Data Issues, Problems and Policies Related to Migration. So, thinking about migration, it is one of the important components of demographic changes that we observe in any population or any nation state. However, relative to other two important components of demographic change, that is mortality change and fertility change, measuring migration change is very challenging. And part of the reason is that there is dearth of quality data on regular basis at different geographical levels in different countries. And so therefore, if you look at movements of people, human population is relatively mobile, but all movements are necessarily not considered to be as migration. Because if you remember, migration actually entails movement which involves significant change in the social milieu of the individual living in a particular area. So basically it means that there has to be re-affiliation of the individual to a new population. So if you think that if this is what migration is, then all other movements, which for instance a lot of people tend to move on daily basis from one place to another in search of their livelihood for various occupation and jobs. For instance, somebody who's living in Delhi might be commuting on daily basis to Agra, maybe to distant place in Lucknow, and by evening he or she might be coming back to his place of origin. And similarly, there are many other movements as well, wherein people tend to move, seasonally or as a group, so which actually does not involve the permanent shift in the social milieu of the population. And so therefore, there are two critical challenges for people who work in the area of migration. One is that, of course, the definition, or how do we define migration, because if you were to work on international comparisons between different countries, it becomes really difficult, because of definitional problems to compare, migration from A country to B country. And secondly, of course, is that because we do not have data at different disaggregated administrative levels over a period of time, then measurement again becomes a critical problem. So if you look at the way the migration is defined, there are a lot of problems related to origin, distance covered, time involved, and so therefore many times demographers, geographers and various social scientists have been using different methods and techniques to make some reasonable assessment of the magnitude of migration which might be occurring in given region. So if we look at the available evidences which is available to us, there are some important pieces of information that can be used to make some reasonable assessment of migration, whether internal or international migration. So among the various sources, one prominent source is the administrative records which are available at the national levels. So administrative records actually is concerned largely with the international migration. So for instance, if you take case of India, Government of India issues visas, residence, work permits. There are various agencies which are operational to control the movement of individual and population in the border areas, different kinds of exit clearances for coming in and going out. So in different part of the world, different countries use these kinds of records to make useful sense about the annual footfall, people who are coming in, and likewise, people who are moving out from the place of origin to other places. So in this way, this forms a very credible and consistent source of information to understand, not only the volume of people who might be going out or coming in, but also it provides you some ancillary information about some of the basic demographic information, for example age characteristics, sex of the person, the place of native of which place, and of course these visas are given for various purposes. So that can also help us to get a sense of what is the major reason why people are choosing to move to some other country, or otherwise if people are moving into the country, then what is the major reason. So in this way administrative records do provide some sense of data related to movement of people coming in or moving out of a country, but by and large this caters to the international migration. So largely it is related to international in-migration or international out-migration, which we call as emigrants who go out from place of origin to place of destination, and immigration wherein people from outside other country are legally moving into the other country. So I mean, this is also important here to emphasize the fact that these administrative records only account for people who are legally migrating between two administrative boundaries. And so therefore this question we present with these questions, which is what about people who are undocumented migrants, or people who may be crossing borders without legal documents. And so therefore scientists and geographer also examine these issues, and there are some methodologies which have been developed to understand the volume of people who may be classified as illegal or undocumented migrants, which is this method called residual method, wherein what they do is that on annual basis they have a record of people who have legally moved into a given country, and so on the basis of total native population, on the basis of total recorded or legally migrant who have come into a population, and so they sum it up and they take the difference between the total population at a given point of time, maybe due to census, and then the difference between total population bifurcated into natives plus those who are legally immigrants, and so that if you add it up, so the difference tells you about number of people who actually are undocumented, and maybe the residual population that may be understood as the undocumented or illegal migrants. Now the second important source to understand the number of migrants in any nation is of course the census. Now census is a complete enumeration of each individual in the defined territory at given point of time of any region or any nation. So that is a complete and most robust count of people who might be living in a defined territory or any nation. Now this census is of course not done on a regular basis in many countries. There are only few countries where the census exercise happen on regular basis, and this because census involves a very large undertaking of logistics, operation, planning and executions. So census cannot be undertaken on very regularly basis, means every year or 2 years. So for example in India the census is being implemented at decadal level. So every decade we are doing census of India. Similarly in many other countries in the West the census operations are being held at regular 5 years interval. So there are some direct questions which are canvassed to the respondent in order to get a sense of an individual may be classified as a migrant or not. So for instance the census of India has got few questions, and based on that one can make an assessment about the individual at the time of enumeration is categorized as migrant or not. So the first important question is the question of place of birth. So on the basis of this question of place of birth, if enumerator is canvassing this question to the respondent, and if the place of birth happens to be different from the place of enumeration, so this can give you a basic idea that this person is of course a lifetime migrant. So on the other hand, if the place of birth and the place of residence happens to be the same, it means that this person is actually a non-migrant. Second important question is the place of last residence. So this question is also important to understand if the individual is a migrant or not. So if the place of last residence of the respondent happen to be the same as the current place of enumeration, then of course this individual is a non-migrant. However, if that is different, which means that if somebody is being enumerated in Delhi and his place of last residence was suppose Mumbai, so it means that the concerned individual is a migrant. So this is another important question to identify and measure the magnitude of migrant by the question of last residence. And so this is also a very interesting question, because it also tells you about the stream of migration, from which place people are moving from and which place people are moving into. Third important question is the duration of residence at a current place. So basically, at the time of census, this question is asked to the respondent, like how long you have been staying at the current place of residence. So if somebody says that I am staying here since my birth, then of course he or she may be understood as a non-migrant. And then there are different categories, some recent migrants who have recently come in last 12 months, maybe 5 years, 10 years, 15 years and 20 years. So that gives us some idea about the duration of stay of an individual at the current place where the enumeration is taking place. So which is a very useful information for policy makers, planners, academicians and researchers to understand that since how long people have been living at a current place of residence. So that is again a very useful information. And the another important question which is asked in the census is related to a place of residence at a fixed prior date. So they give you a particular date and ask if an individual where you were living, and if that happens to be different from the place of enumeration, then again that qualifies to be a migrant. So in this way, the Census of India tries to measure the magnitude of migration and streams of migration, rural to rural, rural to urban, urban to rural, and this way one can make a assessment about movement of people from different districts, different states. Many times people moving in the same district, in the nearby district, people are moving from one state to the other state, and therefore this provides us a good opportunity to understand the magnitude and possible consequences of migration from one region to the other region in the country. Now the problem is that because these data sets are actually collected on decadal basis, so if one has to make some understanding and some investigation on more continuous basis, then these becomes not very useful. So in that case, there are also special surveys which are being conducted time to time in different countries, including in India. For instance, the National Sample Survey Organization, implemented by the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, have been conducting different rounds of survey, particularly on migration in India. And so this is a very special survey because the focus of this survey is basically to understand and quantify the magnitude of migration, migrants, stream of migrants, various reasons and motivations, what are the consequences of migration at the place of origin and destination, understand the demographic, socioeconomic composition or the profile of migrants. So that is providing a wealth of data for policy makers, academician and researcher, and of course the people who are looking at planning the life of citizens, provision of various services, whether it is housing, food, livelihood, education, health, transportation and communications. So all these sort of services can be actually streamlined with these regular inputs and information which are credible and measured at different administrative level. So if you know about National Sample Survey, and migration studies are actually conducted largely at the state level or at the regional level. So and therefore many times if policy makers and decision makers have to work at lower administrative level, for example at the village level or urban ward levels or city levels, these sort of data if become available, that can help even more to understand the problems and challenges faced by the local citizens and particularly migrants, because these are people who are coming in from different regions and part of the nation maybe, and thus brings unique skill sets, cultural traits and practices. So they help to not only build the cities and growth of the cities, but at the same time you also come up with various cultural traditions which enriches the lives in the cities. So therefore, these surveys have become a very important piece of information. In the Indian context, there have been also some surveys on migration at the state level. For example, the Kerala migration studies for the last decade or so has been a very significant attempt which has been made to understand the characteristics of migration, the stream of migration, why people are moving out, or what are the major determinants and the consequences of migration on the livelihood of local people, household level, families and children, and many other implications of migration. So these sort of information and surveys, if they are available on regular basis, can really help us to understand the lives and livelihood of migration and how do they make contribution at the place of origin and place of destination. Dear friends, I must remind all of us that during the COVID pandemic, mostly, everybody was affected in different ways, but migrants were really at a receiving end. And because of various restrictions in different parts of the world which was put in place, several times these migrants were not ready and they did not had support. And so that was a time when it was realized, at the policy level, whether it is at the national level, global level, state level, that how incredible contribution migrants are making in terms of not only economy, society, culture. And so this migrant issue actually got a huge attention, and that was a time in many countries of global south there was a need felt to come up with a robust data systems wherein we must register these migrant and provide them with certain documented rights, so that in cases of emergencies, maybe pandemic, disaster, or any sort of emergencies, the state must account for them and take care of necessity steps and immediate measures which may be required to make sure that their life and livelihood is safe. And so Government of India has also come up with a new draft of migration policy by the Niti Aayog in the year 2021, which is basically talking about securing, you have to register these migrants at where they are working, and some basic informations from where they're coming from, etc., and their Aadhaar and banking information. So basically, at the time of distress, whenever it is, these people may be looked after by the state and central governments. So, and this way, maybe the situation of migrants may be improved given the kind of contribution they are making for cities and different places in the country to prosper. Third important, which is in indirect estimation that often is done at country level and different administrative level, is using the estimation of migration through the growth balance difference. So basically that if you have to compute population change at two different point of time, so there are two major components. One is the natural increase and the net migration. So if you have the total population at time t.1 and total population at t0, then the difference, if you want to estimate, so difference is basically total population minus total natural increase, can help us to understand the net migration which is actually there in a given nation or in a given state. And so in this way, this growth difference method can help us to make an indirect estimation about the possible number of migrants who are there in a particular region or in a particular defined territory. And measuring this undocumented migration, which is of course a very critical challenges, and because of global environmental changes, political turmoil in different parts of the world, many times people have to migrate to save their life and their livelihood of their family members. So they take a lot of risk in order to go through landways, seaways, waterways to save themselves. And so there is no credible data source which is available at national or global level. So indirectly, demographers and geographers and other social scientists, what they do is use these residual methods, which basically is the at any given point of time in any country, you have a number of people who are living as a native citizens. This can be of course estimated through census or projections, and then of course we have an account of the legal document migrants who are coming in for various purposes through the administrative data. So if you know these numbers of the native population that is living in a given area or given nation, and the total number of people who are coming in through various visas and permits and etc. So you know the total people who are legally occupying or legally living in a given area. So the difference between the total population and people, those who are native plus those who are visa and documented, that is left over is basically people who are possibly either illegal migrants or undocumented migrants. And then of course there are various consequences of how these migration is actually influencing, and what are the consequences of migration at both the place of origin and also the place of destination. But before coming to these problems and policies related to migration, I thought that it is important for us to understand how can we understand about the magnitude of migration and understand the characteristics of migration. And this can only be possible if we have a very credible sources of information at the various administrative level. Now today, as that friends, that we are living in an era of sustainable development agenda, UN SDG 2050, and we are already in the year 2023. So 7 years we will be actually touching the the upper bound of the time, which is 2030. Now having said that, population change is an important change that contributes our efforts to reach sustainability development goals, and within that migration is a very important category. So whether it is about reducing the burden of poverty, issues of promoting quality education, etc., understanding and documenting migration is important. So therefore, thank you so much.